name is Tom and I directed the show.
Hey, I'm Tamsin and I am one of the performers in the show.
Hi, I'm Jessie and I'm the other performer in the show.
Hi, I'm Katie Sykes and I'm the designer.
And hey, I'm Tom Crosley-Thorne. I'm the sound designer / composer.
We wanted to adapt The Great Gatsby now because we'd had a really crap year, I think. And that it's a book that I think for a lot of people is associated with a kind of nostalgia for a number of reasons. One of them is that there's a lot of big party scenes in it. So we associate the idea of The Great Gatsby with a big flashy party, but also because a lot of us read it when we were teenagers as part of our GCSE or A-level English. And so it has a sort of association for us with our youth. And I guess after the year we've had, we really were thinking like a lot about, looking back at other points in our lives and thinking, oh, everything was so great then. And it was quite hard to face the reality of the present. And the book itself is like a memory book. It's set in a present, looking back at a time where Nick Carraway experiences a bunch of different things. And that sense of memory, that sense of looking back at something with rose-tinted spectacles felt really important or felt really resonant for us. And then also the character of Gatsby can't kind of deal with his present. He's always trying to look back and recreate a past that is now disappeared and build a future that doesn't exist. And so that sense of not really being able to deal with the present felt really resonant.
In a sort of practical way, we were faced with a lot of challenges in creating a show at this time. So we knew that we couldn't have many people in it. We knew that we'd have to make it in a socially distanced way. And so I think those challenges, actually, we decided to lean into those, and it felt exciting to take this story that's like relatively short in terms of the book, but also that there is a whole multitude of characters in there that we're having to perform with just two people. There's a whole load of parties in there. There's a whole load of romance in there and various things that we're having to perform in a socially distanced way and with the limitations that we had in the room. So I think that also felt quite exciting to lean into that rather than pick something that was maybe felt more like appropriate to a two-hander.
We had I guess the strangest thing about the rehearsal process was just keeping physical distance, both on stage and off. And in a very early production meeting, Katie said something about the fact that A, we hadn't done it for a whole year, and B, it's just different. And so we have to like give ourselves permission for it all to just be different and difficult, and we can only do what we can do. And in a way, like, I just want to say that before every show we ever make, because it's like you can only do what you can do, always. But that was a very like useful and empowering thought, because it meant that we were focusing only on the important things, it seemed to me, because of the limit of what we could do. And again, it's, there's always that phrase which is like, limitations breed creativity. But it's so true. I mean, it's like, I've got two performers and only two, and they're not allowed to touch, already removes an entire set of textures that you can play with as a director, which was really useful. So, but in terms of the practicality of the room, it's just like, just being aware of distance all the time. It was really interesting, but I think the permission to like only do what you can do was very useful and something I'd like to carry forward. In terms of the structure of our rehearsal process, we had a 3-day R&D where the main thing that we were testing with the actors was I suppose, like, how do we make certain elements of story clear, particularly when there's a lot of characters on stage? And we knew that if you've got script in hand, suddenly movement becomes very difficult. And if you've got a microphone in the other hand, that also makes it very difficult. So we were just really testing, like, what do I read when I put up this piece of novel, and they'll just share the text, and like what comes out in the wash, basically. But from that point, we just really needed to cut down a novel into something that could be delivered in the time period, which is about an hour and a half show. So really, we're just hacking away things which we feel like aren't necessary or don't serve the story. And so after transforming the novel into a script, that initial script I think was like 100 pages, which was far too long for what we needed. But each time we returned to that script, that working document, it became clearer and clearer what needed to be removed. So it was a bit of a battle of making that choice about what to cut at the right moment, where we felt like we were going to make a good choice as opposed to a sort of blind choice. And in the R&D, it was very difficult to cut things because it all felt important and all felt like vital to the story somehow. And then the more we got into it and the more we rehearsed it, the more things naturally felt unimportant. And the more we had confidence to say, reduce a paragraph just down to 3 key words that reflected the meaning of that paragraph. So really, I felt like the whole process was just a process of hacking away at this novel, slowly, scoring things out until we found like the purest nugget of story.
I think there's something really interesting about adapting something like The Great Gatsby, which is for some people this like incredible book that they hold really, really dear to their heart and they're very, very attached to, and they studied throughout college, or and some people, they're like, oh yeah, I've heard of that, or maybe they've seen the film, or maybe they've got some vague idea of what it's about. There's a real spectrum. So it was really interesting trying to think of how to accommodate for like every different audience member. I think what was helpful in the room is that I think we represented quite a lot of that spectrum. Like some of us knew it really well, and some of us, the first time we read it was for this project. So I think that really helped. And in the process, I guess we kept going back to, and this is always the case in whatever show you're devising or adapting, I guess, but back to the most simplest form of it. It's very we quickly understood the story so well and those characters so well, and we felt so involved in that story that I think we had to keep stepping back from it and going, okay, wait a minute, if you didn't know any of these people and you didn't know what was going on, what is the very simplest version of this story we're needing to tell? And that's particularly true for an adaptation where you're getting this, like a story like this, down to an hour and a half. And like Tom was saying earlier, like it's written in the most beautifully flowery language. Actually, if you distill it, not a whole lot happens, but it's told in this like beautiful way. So it's always going back to like, what are those key words that the audience need to hear to understand the story?
As there's only 2 performers and we're playing like a multitude of roles, we had to really clearly make sure that everybody knew which character we were. And so it was about also trying to be very clear on stage, not just physically, but also with names and names of characters that maybe you see only once and then they come back again or they're referenced again. So that was another challenge, that we had to make sure people understood who the characters were at certain times.
From a design perspective, it's really interesting when you've got 2 performers having to multi-role, especially if they're flitting between many characters very frequently, because what you want to try and get is the balance between helping the audience understand who they're playing by use of costume, but also not it not becoming like a crazy jumble sale of things being flung back and forth endlessly. So we spent a lot of time, and I spent a lot of time just watching it, trying to work out when we could use costume in and out and when we didn't need to. And so you're constantly judging the clarity of what is coming across and whether or not it just needs that extra bit of support. So that's quite interesting. And you sort of have to keep drip feeding things in terms of costume or props and things to help with that. And then quite often then you can then pull them back once you get the script sort of flowing, and once the actors are getting much more confident about their performances, you can then start kind of culling some of those choices too. Because ideally what you're searching for is to keep it as simple as possible so that it doesn't become manic and constant things happening. So yeah, so that's a really interesting part of helping the clarity of who's playing what and when.
As performers, it was a real challenge, but I think really useful to make us really think about each character we were playing and what was very distinct about them and what made them different to the other characters they were playing. So we worked with like a vocal coach to really think like, what does this character sound like? And what does this character sound like? Where is this character from in America? And where is this character from in America? And how does this character stand? And how does this character stand? So because we're flitting in between the characters so quickly, and because we're basically both on stage all of the time, that it would just be really clear for an audience, like as soon as we moved, okay, that's that character moving because they're moving in that way.
We decided to make an all-female cast, I think fundamentally to give two brilliant female actors the chance to tell the entirety of the narrative and to just do all of the textures that requires, which is a really like fun feat to watch. There's something about like friendships or relationships in it, and I wonder if that's a useful thought, is like that the thing that when I think about this show more than anything, I think about the relationship between you two people on stage and the chemistry between the two of you. And whether as an audience you're viewing that as Jesse and Tamsin, or as Gatsby and Nick, or as Gatsby and Daisy, or as, you know, Nick and his fantasy or his memories, you know, I feel like I just see this relationship and I see this friendship between the two of you. And I guess there's just something there for me that was like very pleasurable to watch about you two getting to know each other on stage somehow.
It's true, because also Jesse and I hadn't worked together before or knew each other. So we were also becoming friends and learning and colleagues on stage in this kind of very socially distanced way as well. So even like touching each other or hugging each other wasn't really allowed. So how do you break those beginning barriers of getting to know someone both on stage and off stage when you can't, like going back to the social distance and how we process that. And I think like you say, giving some to female actors the space to tell a predominantly male story is also just exciting, and it gives them the space to play men, and that's an interesting thing to watch physically. It's not necessarily something that we see a lot done, so giving that space and allowing the creativity to come out of that and what we can find and how that translates into the movements and how the audience are going to perceive that, I think is a really exciting thing to watch in the show and in the theatre.
I think our show is about COVID-19. I think it runs through it in many ways in an obvious way to do with the distancing and all of that, but I think we as a company of creatives and technicians it was a kind of crazy time, because the bridge moment we were doing was right over Christmas, and we were all feeling really quite raw around our own family situations to do with, you know, often that acceptance you're not going to see your family at Christmas and all sorts of things. So I think it's fundamental to this piece. I don't know how much you'd be able to directly see that, but I know as a team it was something, a very unique experience we all went through. We became this little gang of sort of pals, really, in a strange little world of making work in this context, where we all had to really trust each other to be looking out for each other and things in terms of our own health and each other's health. So I think it is, yeah, absolutely. I don't think anybody that's made work in this time can ignore that fact, really.
I agree. I think it's a lot to do with COVID, and I think yeah, whether it's obvious or not, it's very it just feels that also we were talking about where these characters start from this story, and you know, there's this idea of like having a party at home, or you know, because you can't go out, and where that comes from and what that feels like, and then how do you bring up the energy to have another one or to keep going, and I think that element of it you can see throughout the play, especially in the chapter breaks, and this kind of drive through of like trying to keep going, but something's sad pulling you back, something's not quite right, and yeah, and that was definitely part of the COVID experience.
I think that if anything, they're like, you know, we just wouldn't have made it in this way, and I don't think we would have made it with quite such like maybe like emotional vulnerability. It's like that we want, it was like, it's very, I look, when I was watching the video and looking back and going, oh, it's really like, it's just really it's really emotional.
The themes of the show that actually really found their way into us reflecting on our COVID-19 lives, in that, you know, like we talked a lot about alcohol and Nick's relationship with alcohol, but our sort of ourselves, you know, we drink a lot during the show, and we drink a lot in between the scenes, in between the, sort of these chapter breaks, and actually our relationship with being at home with nothing to do but maybe drink or try and like imagine our lives or go back into this nostalgic time. Nick's essentially like telling this story of feeling nostalgia for this time when he was going to parties and when he was meeting his friends, and when he was feeling like this time when he felt most like physically and like emotionally connected to people. So I think those themes that we were pulling through the show actually really resonated with us at this time.
I really still love our little hug, like before we had our first run ever, and then because of COVID, I was like, both of us, I think, were so desperate to connect, and we knew that we couldn't hug, but then we were like, I've got a hug, we've got a hug. And so we hugged each other with our rain jackets on over our heads, and like inside out. And then we had this lovely hug, which was very moving.
It was interesting for me because as a designer, I usually get quite a long run in to think about a project beforehand, but this was very quick. It wasn't long before I got asked to do it for us to actually start rehearsing. I think it was something like 6 weeks or something, wasn't it, Tom? But that kind of suits me as well. I quite like that. And also I knew that the show was not going to be a big show. It was going to be small scale in its scope. So it was, that didn't worry me particularly. But what it meant was, because I've never read the book, so I thought I'm going to listen to it. So I listened to an audio version. And what is great about doing that as a designer is that you can listen to it, and then the pictures, you can kind of start forming pictures in your head, which I find much easier than when I'm actually reading it, and I can kind of potter about while I listen to it, and it just makes my mind free roam a bit better. And then so I just had to very quickly kind of emotionally respond to the story by pulling some images out of off the internet and things, and just having a little think about some of the chief kind of emotional sort of bullet points of the piece that I thought we could try and explore. And so then I just grabbed some images and sent them over to Tom. And so Tom, do you want to talk about what I sent to you and what it did to you?
Yeah, so that what we were keen on in the first conversations that Katie and I had were that I think The Great Gatsby has a lot of like aesthetic baggage, like a lot of a kind of baggage around excess and wealth and like a certain and champagne and stuff like that. So we were quite keen for the production on the very beginning to just be like, we don't have to do those things because it's like sort of everyone knows that already, but instead let's try and find, like, I think what you said about it, kind of the emotional bullet points of it is right, which is that what would be a world that would feel like kind of honest to the emotional sense of the book. And a lot of the images you sent were kind of like contemporary party world, I think, and things like, and there was one image in particular which was of some plastic sheets and a kind of slightly trashed house with paint everywhere, and we were like, oh, that's cool, isn't it? You know, and we thought that really that would be that, but then Katie was talking about painting on stage, and again, I think for the conversation we're having, it goes back to like, what's the character of the book? And the character of the book and the way that Fitzgerald writes is so lyrical, and it's actually like excessive language. You know, it's like there's just so much poetry packed into it. It's written like a long poem, and there's all these weird ways of saying simple things. And so it's like, keep trying to think about like, oh, you know, Fitzgerald knows that he's writing a great American novel, like he wants to write the great American novel. And so there's something about the creation of that which felt really exciting. So that kind of opened up this thing about painting, I think, a little bit, is that you could build something on stage very consciously. You could, there could be an artistry on stage in a way. And you've done that before, Katie, in another show.
Yeah, I have done it, but obviously in a completely different context. But and it was so I knew the kind of practical implications, and there is a lot of practical implications. You know, obviously there gets paint everywhere for one thing, and that's a challenge. So you have to make this decision. If you're going to use paint from the get-go, which is why we looked at it very early on in rehearsals, you then plan around that. So that informs a lot of other decisions to do with the practicality of it, all of which then become part of the design, which is also quite exciting. So yeah, the paint, I mean, I want, you know, that thing of doing party scenes is always a challenge, I think, on stage, and often it's done where, you know, lots of people come on in lots of party clothes, and somehow I'm often not terribly sort of satisfied by that myself as a designer. So it was a way for us to sort of find a different language for that, and we just had a go, and we basically, you know, got Tamsin and Jessie to just go for it with big loud music and do lots of painting in rehearsals. And I think all of us just felt really excited by that as being a sort of release, a different kind of language. And then obviously that then took a lot of refining to build those moments in with the music and in with the dancing, and, you know, and it became quite a sort of technical scene. And then it was a case of trying to find the life back again. So it's a really interesting kind of chicken and egg process when you put something like that into a piece where there are these two non-painters who are being asked to create an exciting piece of visual artwork live on stage is quite an ask, and especially given all the other things we're asking them to do. So amazing by both of them to kind of have a go and embrace that, and ended up doing it brilliantly. So it was really exciting. And although we're talking about kind of trying to be quite maybe contained in our sort of ambitions with this piece due to COVID, actually doing live painting on stage is quite an ambitious thing to do, even in a small scale way. So I think the fact that we just had to keep believing in our initial reaction to it, and it felt so exciting and right for this piece, that we kind of pushed through the pain of actually then being realistic about what that meant technically. So yeah, so I'm really pleased about that, because it was great, and it gives this literally a changing canvas, which is also then enhanced by lighting, and obviously Tom's music and sound starts to, these lovely abstract things start to layer up to support the performances. So it's yeah, it was great once we put it all in context in the theatre.
It felt like we were always trying to make the right decision at the right time. in a process like this, which is very short and truncated, it's like you want to make all the decisions right at the get-go, or you want to go and go, let's go, but actually everyone's learning about what the show is slowly. And it's like, I remember feeling like, okay, there's some problems with chapter 1 and 2, but we will not be in a position to tell what those problems are until we've blocked through to the end of the show. So, and costume is an interesting example of that. It's like, what props we need and what costumes we need, we just don't know until we've done the whole thing once through, you know. And that was definitely true for props, for example. There was a lot more props at the beginning of the rehearsal process that we were slowly just pulling away. And I think I'm sort of really proud of like everyone's ability to just kind of get on board with that and to simplify, and again just taking it to like the root, what's the root nugget of this thing. And the painting right at the beginning of the rehearsal process, we had about 3 days of playing with painting right at the beginning of the rehearsal process, and I think that was like became the sort of tent poles of the production. Okay, at this point there's going to be this painting, at this point there's going to be painting, and like we knew we had to negotiate around that and kind of make sense of that. And in a way, there's a lot of these moments, I think, in every show I've done, which feel like you just make a weird decision that feels like a gut decision, like that feels right at some point in the process, and you just got to live with it, and then you will make sense of it as it goes on. Like it will become relevant to you, even if you can't articulate why at the beginning of the process.
Let's start, I guess, with like what we talked about in the R&D for like just general, what is the music that we want to use to tell this version of Great Gatsby? And we spoke about nostalgia, and we spoke about like not necessarily using cliches of 1920s, or because we didn't want to set it in that time, or maybe like not really using any of the stuff that was in any of the big like Baz Luhrmann films, and not referencing what people already know about the Great Gatsby, because that's not the story that we're necessarily going to tell. So it offered maybe a massive amount of options, which was interesting to come in. And that R&D, those 3 days, me and Tom just spoke about, let's try just drums over this whole thing and just see what that looks like. And let's try just some like slow textures over this. And like, maybe they're a bit like nostalgic, maybe they sound a bit 80s, but also what does that nostalgia mean to us? So on a wider net, all of the wardrobe ensemble, all the other members put in together this Spotify playlist, which was nostalgic for them, and it contained things like Genesis, Justice, like there was hip hop in there was just loads in there. But what did it look like when we put a scene up and put some of that music under it? So it gave us a really good reference. And I think the idea of like tent poles is really strong, because it was like, cool, there's a party, and a party looks really good with like Genesis underneath it. So we can use that as our basic like skeleton for the party, right? We can use the tempo of that, but maybe we want to put our own version in. So we started by like cutting it up and seeing what if this bit just had text over the top, and it was like dialogue needed to be the loudest thing there, so drop it all down. And it gave an idea for what a party structure could look like for us. So then when it got to rehearsal, it was more like, what is our version of Genesis? And it kind of became, okay, we want to have some of these modern contemporary noises in there, but we also still want to include some of the like jazzier bits from 1920 as well, but then we want some nostalgic stuff, so it's got to sound a bit like things from Drive, or you know, kind of those 80s moments. So we had a lot to put in, but once we cracked, I think, what that was, like in most projects, there's like a definitive thing that then allows the rest of your palette to be set. I think the party was the one for me. And then it kind of offered like the ability to use those slower textures and maybe not worry necessarily about melody. So one big thing I was struggling with at the start was, if I have a melody for each character, if I have a musical motif, I'm just going to be like doing too many musical moments for any audience to want to follow, as well as you have to really spend the time listening to these actors. I mean, they're telling the story. The music had to sit back because of the amount of like changing character or movement that was happening. So it gave us like a chance to actually limit then what the palette had become, which was really useful. So leaving you in a space, you've been through a story, you're like sitting in this moment that feels like you've had storytelling. Like, what can the music give that isn't necessarily more story, but is like leaving you with a feeling? And so I think that was the kind of idea, that the general contemporary sound of the whole thing that can give you some nostalgia if you're someone that responds to the music in that way, but it's not mimicking anything. And then also is giving you a new feeling. The story is not what you've read before. The music is giving you something that can take you somewhere different, and the immersion that that offers you. So yeah, the music had a job to do, a very specific one, but also how far could it be pushed? And I think we found a really good space with that, with the sound design.
Early on in the process, I just remember apologizing to Tom a lot, because I kept saying, he was asking me a lot of really good questions, and I kept being like, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And then I would say things like what it definitely wasn't. So I was like, it's not 1920s. Like, we can't have anything that says 1920s too much. And then it was like, he put in a real sound of like a horn, you know, sort of like a car horn or something. And I'm like, no, it's not real. It shouldn't be real. There should be nothing real about it. So I kept saying what it wasn't. But what was amazing about that is then Tom managed to like refashion musical elements from the 1920s, like jazz instrumentation, jazz age instrumentation, but then do things to them that just felt really unexpected. Like there's a couple of driving scenes, and when a car drives by, it's trumpets flying by, or it's like, and there's all and the relationship to drums and the play is really interesting. And so I think like all of that, I guess the refashioning or repurposing of a musical language you could understand into something that felt really different and was really exciting to listen to. And
I thought that you always worked with Tom in the room all the time, and I was like, oh my god, this is a dream. And like, you would go away and suddenly come back 5 minutes later and be like, yeah, so like I've just made this, like on the spot there, like making it whilst we're rehearsing. And he's like, oh yeah, you know that music that you needed, how about this? And to be able to have that in the room, like immediately, to then try it out and put it onto what we were then creating on stage, it was such a great process. And I think like from now on, that's the only way I'm ever going to work. Like,
just again, this conversation around, we've all got an image of like a Gatsby themed party in our heads, and we just really wanted to avoid that, because the novel is many other things. And I think the thing about a relationship to the film, for example, the recent film, is like the glitz and the glamour is all done so well and it looks so expensive. But there's also just a lot of other textures that go on in this novel that are weird, are like dirty and jolty and strange. And so I guess it's always just wanting to find like the lyrical or emotional truth of the novel, as opposed to like all that visual baggage that we think about when we think of The Great Gatsby. We think of like the party, and it just feels like, you know, alongside helping shift location, Chris has like found the emotional core of each scene really cleverly, I think. Some really experimental, odd lighting states that we talked about it in terms of like dance lighting, actually, that it was trying to be sculptural and not necessarily light the two actors front on really well, but actually sometimes it's about shape and it's about their bodies in space, and it's about the emotional intensity of a particular moment, really. Really looking forward to performing it in front of a live audience, and I think we're going to learn a lot about the show in terms of, particularly in terms of rhythm, and the role of like laughter in a show is always really interesting in terms of what that does to the rhythm, and also different emotional intensities of the shows. Like, I think for the two performers, they could understand the purity of like, it's me and you know, we're telling this story together, and then when suddenly you have to bring in 100 people into that storytelling moment, like, it's going to be really exciting to know what that does to the show.
As a performer who says the vast majority of my lines to the audience. Having an audience to tell the story to will make a huge difference. Like, we always, in terms of keeping our shows fresh, we always sort of talk about the phrase of like, you know, remember, this audience has never heard this story before. Imagine you're saying these lines for the first time. And obviously, while I still tried to hold on to that throughout the rehearsals, Tom has heard these lines many times from me. So having fresh people, like a few times we were able to have some of our other collaborators to come in and watch runs, and just having one fresh person in the space, you're like, this is why I'm telling this story. I'm telling this story to this person who's never heard these words before. That just, even for me as a performer, saying those words for the millionth time, I hear them in a new light every time I see them, because I'm imagining this person hearing them for the first time, and that always makes a huge difference in the way that you interpret the story that you're telling.
Can't wait. Bring on the audience. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we're all theatre makers and we all love and make our work for live performance. So as amazing as it's been to create this archive footage, and not just archive footage, but footage for people to be able to watch from different parts of the planet at different times of the day. And that's a new thing, and that's a great a great opportunity that this COVID situation has brought about. But on top of how brilliant that is, like, so excited to get back in the space with some people and their reactions and how that makes us react. And, you know, we have to be live, we have to, you know, do it there and then, and that's so exciting, and it's what we live for. So yeah, bring it on.